What exactly makes a good fanfiction? Well, the answer is quite simple. It's all the same things that make any story good. These things are characterization, character development, conflict, story, style, and formatting. So with even a basic understanding of these points and just a little bit of help, almost any concept can be made to work in a story. But there are also things you should avoid if at all possible. Stereotypes, tropes, and memes will often bring down the overall quality of characterization and story to make them either poor, annoying, or just plain boring. Bad writing style and formatting can make a story hard to follow in the best cases, or render it completely unreadable any other time. But with all that being said, it's possible to make bad things work, and it's also possible for there to be too much of a good thing. So let's see if I can't give those listening an idea of what I look for when reading and examining a story. Also keep in mind as we go through this video that a lot of the things I'm going to say may not be the textbook definitions of certain aspects of storytelling. But before we continue here, I highly suggest checking the links in the description and watching my previous video on original characters, Digibrony's video on characterization, and responses made by Bronycurious and Paleo. There are a lot of points made in these videos that will help you understand this large part of storytelling. Characterization to me is quite simply how you define the characters in your universe. The goal is that no matter what is happening in the story, or no matter how the world around them works, the characters and their interactions with the universe must remain multidimensional and believable. A flat character is someone who reacts the same way to everything regardless of the actual stimulant. A Mary Sue or Gary Stu character are overly capable or overly helpless in a general sense. These two types of characters are rarely interesting to read about. Multidimensional characters, on the other hand, occur when the character is shown in a variety of situations and reacts differently to each of them. It's important to note even that the most jaded and sarcastic characters are still capable of a variety of emotions like happiness, laughter, sadness, anger, and everything else. Choosing how a character would react differently to various scenarios is when it becomes important to have an extremely thorough understanding of a character's backstory. Just about everything from the time that they were born leading up to what is taking place in the narrative will affect how they react to it. Where this gets difficult, at least for me, is accounting for the X factor that is a person's ability to change their pattern of thinking and reacting, or how two people can experience the same event or have a very similar backstory but still come out as completely different characters. Take 3 abuse victims I've known as an example. All grew up very similarly. One, as they are today, builds on what they've experienced to know how to be a stronger and better person themselves so that they avoid making the same mistakes. Another allowed it to become a part of them, so now they often, though unintentionally, recreate the very circumstances that they grew up in and tried to escape, and sometimes project the same abuses they've received to those around them. The third internalized their abuses and views everything that's happened to them as their fault for being inadequate. This person is a perfectly functional individual despite a severe lack of self-esteem. I don't believe we can ever fully understand why someone makes the choices that they make as to how they let their experiences affect them. We can only understand that these are the choices that they make. This type of X factor leaves characterization decisions like this to the writer's discretion. Even then, they must still be motivated to some degree by the way the character has already been established. It's the fact that people with the same experiences can turn out completely differently from one another that causes these types of decisions to be the most difficult part of characterization. Just remember, as I said in the previous paragraphs, that all of these people are still capable of feeling the spectrum of emotions almost in its entirety. Being multidimensional helps characterization, but it doesn't always help them become more believable. Part of having a believable character is knowing when and how a certain type of character will react. For example, a character who has never experienced combat before will likely freeze or have poor reactions during their first few battles. This is despite whatever attitude, training, or personality they may or may not have. Of course, this is just one example of many possibilities, but things of this nature have to do with the consistency of character traits that are established at the beginning of a story. It also helps to decide and understand what a character's strengths and weaknesses are and know them as well as you know your own strengths and weaknesses, if not better. This will give you a starting point and help you decide how these traits will change as your character is affected by the story. But just be sure to find a balance in your characters. A character that is too flawed will likely become unlikable, and not in the anti-hero/villain type of unlikable either. I'm talking about the bad type of unlikable that makes the story difficult to enjoy. But even their strengths shouldn't be overpowered either, as this, in the best case scenario, will make a character uninteresting. Being relatable is also a large part of characterization, and the successful application of such will greatly increase how engaging a character is. Relatability, to me, is quite simply how well a character resembles an actual person, as in the reader or someone the reader might know. For me, it's actually one of the easier components of characterization to comprehend and execute. I'll use the words of some writing advice that was given to me recently. When developing a character, the character should be as real to you as someone you know in life. So find someone you know that is like the character and model them as such. Here are some examples of how I would apply this while writing fanfictions. Applejack is my father, Rainbow Dash is my best friend, I have an Aunt Rarity, Fluttershy was once a student of mine, I was once betrothed to Twilight Sparkle, and the list could go on. Having these comparisons in your head can greatly simplify decisions regarding the other points of characterization I've mentioned in this segment, as well as decisions regarding points on character development that I'm about to make. Simply because now you have something in your life that you can draw from. All you have to do is ask yourself, what would this person do in this situation? Or perhaps even better, you could just ask them yourself. For the purpose of avoiding reiteration, please keep in mind that many of the points brought up in the characterization section apply here as well. In order for a character to exist, there must be a story. In the story, there must be conflict. This conflict must be something that challenges the character's strengths and weaknesses and forces them to use those traits to overcome the challenge with room for changes necessary. These changes could range in anything from growth or shrinkage in the strengths and/or weaknesses to a completely different revelation in how the character views themselves. However you choose to do this really doesn't matter on its face value, but in one way or another, a character should almost be a different person at the end of a story than who they were at the beginning of the story. It helps to see a character go through a variety of situations in the story that allows me, as a reader, to see them exercise their strengths as well as encounter hurdles due to their weaknesses. This way, not only do they become more relatable, but it also brings out a lot of potential for development to the story. Any good story will have several stages. Any listeners with an American middle school or above education in English should know these. Introduction, conflict, rising action, climax, falling action, and conclusion. And the whole story should have a distinct beginning, middle, and end. Consistency is extremely important to both plot and characterization. Be sure to plan your story out ahead of time as much as possible. This will help you avoid plot holes, which happen anytime one part of your narrative contradicts itself from another part of your story. All stories need conflict in order for plots and characters to develop. Again, most of you should know what these mean, or at least be able to figure out what they entail by their titles. Man versus man, man versus self, and man versus nature are the big ones. Any one of these, or any combination of them, can be used as the centerpiece of the story. Even better stories will have one type of conflict for the overarching plot, and at least one other type of conflict for however many subplots are in the story. Here's an example off the top of my head. A group of meteorologists team up to build a weather machine that they hope will prevent a natural disaster from occurring. This could be your overarching conflict of man versus nature. However, one of the scientists discovers that doing so may damage the overall ecosystem in a different way over the long term and wrestles with the morality of playing God in an attempt to figure out if it's better to risk lives immediately for the preservation of nature or risk lives in the balance of nature in the future to meet a short-term goal. This would be your subplot of man versus self. Whatever happens after that and how the plot and subplots intertwine depends on your decisions based on the points I made while talking about characterization and character development. All of this boils down to a question you should ask yourself when conceptualizing your story. Does my concept have potential for plot, conflict, and character development? If it doesn't, you really don't have much of a story or even potential for a story. I'm going to take this opportunity to answer a question I've been asked a few times in the comments section. What do I think about Human in Equestria stories? Well, I'm subscribed to the Human in Equestria group on filmfiction.net, so I see a lot of them. I also see their forums section, which gets at least 3 threads per day asking if people would read a story that is usually along the lines of famous person / video game character / anime character goes to Equestria. These crossover ideas are not only extremely unfitting most of the time, but have very little potential for story. Most of the idea is that the person gets teleported to Equestria and reacts / gets reacted to by whatever cast happens to be there. This is not a story. Another big chunk of them are the video game and anime characters that are randomly and inexplicably teleported to Equestria to either do nothing or simply break everything. These would be your concepts like Big Daddy or Broly goes to Equestria. But none of this is to say that I dislike the genre of Human in Equestria. I wouldn't still be a member of the group if there wasn't at least a few stories of this genre that I very much enjoy and wish to find more of them. I just brought this up because it's in that group of stories where I see the majority of incomplete story concepts, attempts at said concepts, and the subsequent failing in the execution of said concepts. Good style is difficult for me to define because despite my belief that there are standards for good and bad styles, I'm trying to keep in mind that different writers will have different writing styles. This type of thing is what makes literature a living art form, which grants just as much creative freedom as it has aesthetic rules. I suppose what's most important is that the writer successfully conveys the information that they wish to convey, be this an event, an action, an emotion, an expression, a thought process, or any combination of the aforementioned. However this is done is not important as long as the majority of readers are clear as to what happened and its level of significance. Description is a large part of a writer's style. Short descriptions get points across fast but aren't always picked up by the audience. Detailed descriptions slow down the reader's perception of actions in the universe and helps their understanding or conveys a character's understanding of an event. However, not enough description can leave a reader confused as to what is going on, and too much description becomes difficult to read, boring, and risks redundancy. Both of these extremes will likely remove a reader from the experience and make a story difficult to enjoy. It's important to understand the effects of short and long or detailed descriptions and when they can be used effectively so that a descriptive middle ground can be met whenever different levels of emphasis are not needed. A very common example of unnecessary description in the writing style that drives me nuts is whenever the character is described after they're introduced. For example,
"Hey, I could clear the sky in 10 seconds flat,"
the prism-clad speedster announced. Once we establish a character's name, we no longer need to refer to them by their descriptive traits. I know Rainbow Dash is a blue flyer. I know Applejack is a farmer. I know Twilight Sparkle is a bookworm. I don't need to be reminded of this after every time one of them speaks. There's also the infamous showing versus telling concept. Suffice it to say that most readers prefer showing, as it helps their visualization of the world they are reading about and the events that transpire within. This makes the story much easier to read and usually helps make it more enjoyable. Telling, however, is more like being spoon-fed information with little immersion or emotional connection. I liken it to trying to find a thrilling story in a high school chemistry textbook. Despite this being one of the first things taught in creative writing, in my opinion, it is one of the most difficult to perform. I've had 4 writing tutors instruct me in 4 different methods of showing versus telling, and a couple of these theories thoroughly contradict each other. That being said, I will fully admit that I don't understand this concept well enough to describe how to successfully execute it with words. However, I can say that a blocky writing style is often one of the traits of telling. This is usually seen when most of the descriptions, regardless of the situation, are written with short yet complete sentences. Tasteful and somewhat frequent use of metaphor and simile is usually a sign of a showing descriptive style. Beyond this, I can only claim to know what showing and telling is when I see them. So take Liberate the Sun by Seether00 as an example of showing, and The Girl with the Liar Tattoo by Dennis the Menace as an example of telling. Give them a read and see if you can figure out the pattern. Format, to me, holds a lot of common ground with style, but leans more towards grammatical correctness. Therefore, I believe that there is not nearly as much creative freedom in format as there is with style. Every word, every comma, semicolon, colon, single quote, double quote, parentheses, apostrophe, hyphen, accent, and ampersand has a specific function. I trust that most of us have seen how putting any of these symbols in the wrong place or using the wrong type of there and your can completely change the entire sentence, possibly affecting the reader's interpretation of the entire story. All of that being said, it's extremely important to understand as much of technical formatting as possible. Then, even after you've written your story, check, double check, triple check, and then have someone else check your work for you to make sure that you've done it all correctly. Here are a few common grammatical and formatting errors I've seen. 1. Overuse of the comma. There are only a few scenarios where a comma should be used more than twice in a written sentence. The most common is in dialogue when a character is addressing another character in the middle of a sentence. The second most common is when making a list in a dialogue or narrative. Too many commas will create run-on sentences that deliver too much information at one time. Not enough commas will create short, blocky, and uninteresting sentences. 2. Try to avoid starting sentences with the words and or because or using them after a comma. 3. Start a new paragraph and indent whenever someone different speaks. I'll stick a few examples in the description. As you can see, there is a big difference, and knowing it can make all the difference in the reader's comprehension of the story. When the various points I've mentioned thus far are not properly executed in a story, they often lose much of their quality. But they're not the only things that can bring a story down. Many different tropes and memes in stories, especially fan fictions, will carry negative connotations because they are signs of unoriginality and overdone or often poorly executed concepts. However, it's incredibly rare that you'll find a character or a story that does not fall into at least 2 tropes that are usually seen with a negative connotation. The trick is to make them a part of the character in an interesting way and try to embrace them with a new spin. Or at least try to execute the cliches properly with the other points that I've discussed in this video. Take the human in Equestria and pony on Earth genres of femfictions as examples again. These genres usually stir up negative feelings because too often have they been written where the main character is teleported to Equestria for an arbitrary and inadequately explained reason and simply starts their new life in a completely different world. Or it goes the other way around with one of the characters from the show. This is an example of a negative trope that will usually drag down the quality of your story, albeit an unavoidable one if you plan on writing a story like this in the first place. But what if your character is brought to Equestria for a reason and by a reason? This meaning that someone in Equestria reached out to Earth to pick out a person either specifically or at random because a human was needed to further whatever is happening in the plot of the story and causes the story to surround this element. A good example of this is Why Am I Pinkie Pie by Hoopie McGee, and a good example of this going in the other direction with Pony on Earth is The Girl with the Liar Tattoo. What if you have an original character with an angsty and dim outlook on life? These characters often come out flat as pancakes and annoying as an itchy limb inside of a cast. But what if their attitude serves a purpose to the story, the character demonstrates a full range of emotions, and is given the opportunity to arc by the author? Then there is limitless potential for making this bad trope work. What if you're writing a romantic story between 2 or more characters? These usually go down with very little and improper build-up if there was any build-up to begin with. But what if you establish the relationship like a real relationship, that being over time and based on compatible personalities? Or perhaps even a lack thereof that causes tension in the relationship. These are just a few ways you can embrace a trope that is often looked down on at an original angle. But now I must ask a question of myself. Am I a good writer? The truth is, I don't know. I used to think I could be a good writer, but I've come to find that anytime I write alone, I tend to fall into the same traps that I've mentioned throughout this discussion and not even realize it. A possibility that distinctly exists even as I go through this video. But somehow, I can manage to a certain degree to pick up on finding these mistakes in other people's works while reading them. Does this mean I'm a better writer than they? Or does it simply reflect the fact that most people can take a story and look at it from a fresh perspective because they themselves did not write it? If the latter is the case, does that mean that all writers need assistance to make their stories better? Or is it just the truly good writers that can do it without need of assistance? These are all questions that I don't have complete answers to. This is why I always highly encourage rebuttal and discussion from those who may be listening, as it offers the opportunity to fill in these blanks or even be proven wrong on certain points. That being said, everything mentioned in this video is what I believe makes a good story. Hopefully these points can help someone out there examine their own work to help improve themselves, as well as answered a few questions that I've received regarding my thoughts on human and Equestria stories and original characters. And like always, if you have an opinion on any of these points mentioned in the video, I'm always open to further discussion. If you have a topic on bronies, ponies, news, or anything in general that you would like to hear discussed, or if you have an episode, fanfiction, product, or anything else you would like to hear reviewed, send me a YouTube message or leave a comment below. You can also drop comments, questions, topic suggestions, and review suggestions by liking Brony Debates on Facebook, following on Twitter, or sending an email to bronydebates@yahoo.com. Have a great day, and I look forward to speaking with all of you soon.